How Mark Few is once again ahead of the curve in college basketball, plus thoughts on the end of amateurism in the NCAA and the future of the sport, all on today's Mailbag edition of the Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Monday and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster, and they do it for free. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. Today is a full Mailbag Monday edition of the show, collecting questions from as many as 2 weeks ago in some capacities. We had some excitement the last couple of Mondays with the Braeden Smith commitment with the holiday, so haven't gotten to do a full Mailbag show in a while, but got a lot of great questions to get through today. As a reminder, if you want to get involved in Mailbag Monday, the best way to do so is to join our Discord channel. There is a link in the show notes, whether you are on audio or on YouTube. You click that link, you get invited in. It is free to join. There's over 350 Gonzaga fans. We're all talking Gonzaga basketball 24/7 in there. You can get your mailbag questions answered that way. You can also email me directly at andypatton013@gmail.com if you want to get your question or questions answered that way as well. First question of the show today comes from Salag16 on Discord, who says, Gonzaga has a few transfers this year who are really for future rosters, with one even taking a red shirt. Is this unique to Gonzaga, or are other programs able to also recruit transfers into bench roles with bigger roles in the future? Or is this Mark Few getting ahead of the trend again in college basketball, similar to his success with international players and grad transfers? Interested on your take. Folks, the best way to hear my take on this thought, on this question, which is a fantastic question from Derek here, is to listen to Friday's episode of Locked On Zags. And I don't typically like giving that answer, and I'll give a brief one here as well, but that was pretty much the entirety of Friday's episode, was discussing Mark Few's fantastic offseason, what I'm considering at this point the best offseason in all of college basketball. And a lot of that conversation derived around Mark Few's ability to supplement the current roster, first of all, to retain everybody who was a key contributor from last year's team except Anton Watson, who was unable to return to school, and then to be able to add key pieces. Again, I don't think that the transfer portal class Gonzaga brought in is the best transfer portal class in terms of overall talent, only because programs like Kansas and Alabama and others brought in just multiple five-star caliber transfers. But for Gonzaga, the ability to supplement the pieces with players who fit well. Ajayi fits well as an Anton Watson replacement. Caliph Battle fills a role that wasn't on last year's Gonzaga roster, but is incredibly valuable. And then to also use this offseason to build for the future. Nobody else is able to do that. To answer the question, no. I don't think there are other teams who are able to do this. There are other teams who are able to occasionally add a transfer who's either going to play a small role and then grow into a bigger role another year, or whatever it may be. But most big-time programs are not doing that. They're either unable to, and they're just seeing those players, that come in and then leave, which, to be fair, has happened to Gonzaga. Efton Reed was brought in intentionally to do that, come in, play a smaller role, and then develop into a bigger role. He chose to go somewhere else. Nothing wrong with that. It happens. It's just an acknowledgement that Gonzaga is not perfect in that regard, but their ability to do it is pretty top-notch. And like you mentioned in the question with the international recruits and with the grad transfers, once again, we're seeing Gonzaga do something that I suspect eventually other teams will start to do. I think that the rules being so ever-changing in college basketball make it difficult to predict what this might look like 5 years from now. But there's a possibility that we are seeing players 3, 4, 5 years from now willing to transfer to places, sit out a year, or play smaller roles, and then develop into bigger roles in the future. It wouldn't surprise me if that becomes a bigger thing in college basketball, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if Mark Few and the Zags are again ahead of the curve there, because that's kind of where they have been in the last 25 years. There's a reason you make 25 straight NCAA tournaments. It's not just being in the WCC. You got to be somebody who's kind of on the cutting edge of the sport, and Mark Few and the Zags staff have always been in that conversation. Next question here comes from Strike Nowhere on Discord, who says, can you explain the House lawsuit and deal that the NCAA and Power 4 schools agreed to settle, particularly how this could affect the Zags, assuming it doesn't get held up elsewhere? I would really love to be able to explain this better than I'm going to explain it. I'm just going to say that right now. It is complicated. It is confusing. It is ongoing. It is ever changing. And there's still a lot of legal hurdles and things to still happen. How this impacts mid-major programs is pretty hard to fully understand at this point. The scale is difficult to comprehend. Some basic information. The NCAA is going to pay out about $2.8 billion effectively to former student athletes who were not compensated before the NIL era. Basically, it is a back pay for student athletes who weren't able to get that money because they did not play college. They were not student athletes during the NIL era. That's the effective baseline description of it. Going forward, schools will also be able to directly pay student athletes. That is the big deal. It is the end of amateurism. The idea that college athletes are no longer directly paid by the school, that they are student athletes, that they are not employees, is basically going away. Now, they're not actually employees yet, and that is where this gets tricky, is amateurism is gone. That concept is officially gone. It's been on life support for a while, but now it is done. Schools can directly pay student athletes. The last few years in the NIL era, they have been through NIL collectives that have been paying the students. These schools have not directly been paying students. That's the difference. That is the difference. In terms of how it impacts mid-major programs, there's a lot of kind of panic that it's going to be more difficult for mid-major schools, that they're going to take on a bigger burden of the NCAA's lawsuit and the amount of money that the NCAA has to pay out to former student athletes, that it could impact mid-major schools more, where the power programs maybe aren't going to be as impacted by that. They may break off away from the NCAA. That's been a big fear for a long time. But a lot of this is speculation. A lot of this is just uncertainty. For Gonzaga, here's what I will say. Gonzaga has not struggled to land student athletes in the sports that they want to using NIL. They are not struggling to bring in marquee talent. The idea that direct pay from schools is going to impact Gonzaga, I don't think it's going to be in a significantly negative way. Gonzaga brings in a ton of money from TV revenue, tons of money from TV. People, they have a really high TV power ranking. They are a power player in terms of college basketball, unquestionably. And I don't think that directly paying student athletes is going to negatively impact Gonzaga all that much. But I am curious what happens if the WCC becomes less viable for Gonzaga, if that becomes more of a challenge for them, if they get a little bit more desperate to leave. Like, there are things that I think will start to happen that may impact Gonzaga, that will impact Gonzaga, and the decisions that they'll have to make to try to land somewhere a little bit more viable for them. I do think that this has an impact on conference realignment. It's hard to know exactly what, because it's in such the early stages. And so I know that this is not a particularly conclusive answer, but I promise you, if I knew the conclusive stuff to answer these questions, I would tell you, but I would also be probably getting paid a whole lot of money from somebody else, because there's nobody out there who knows a lot of the answers to these questions at this point. It is a topic we will revisit probably quite a few times this summer, so hang tight on that one. Next question comes from I Think Ergo I Am on Discord, who says, given the new transfer portal landscape where elite basketball schools construct their team with more experienced players who are further along their college careers, relying less on freshmen, do you think some or most mid-majors and junior colleges will essentially become freshman farm teams for more elite basketball schools? And if true, which mid-majors or junior college teams are most similar to Gonzaga's system, who could be freshman stop-offs before they come to Gonzaga? So to answer the first question, yes, this is already happening. It's already happening. The look at the freshman of the year in every mid-major conference. Like, go if you find a list on the internet somewhere of who won the freshman of the year in every conference that's not the Power Six, and that player has almost certainly transferred to a higher program. Almost certainly, it's like a 90% rate in that area. Like the WCC, two of the best freshmen in the conference last year were Tyler Harris at Portland and Kevin Patton Jr. at San Diego. Kevin Patton is now at USC. Tyler Harris is now at Washington. That's a great example right there. The WAC, Emmanuel Innocenti was he wasn't the WAC freshman of the year. The WAC freshman of the year transferred to Grand Canyon for what it's worth, but the Innocenti was on the WAC all freshman team. He, of course, comes to Gonzaga. That's already happening. Junior colleges are putting less and less players at the Division I level because D1 programs can look to add from mid-majors as opposed to landing players from the junior college level. It's still happening. Michael Ajayi, obviously a great example, who went from a junior college to Pepperdine and then to Gonzaga, but it's already happening. And in terms of what programs are most like Gonzaga, that's a really tough question to answer. I think you want to talk about programs that stylistically run like a similar offense to Gonzaga, where therefore the players would adjust more quickly at Gonzaga. I think that's the general crux of the question here. I think you maybe look at programs that have coaches who have been connected to Gonzaga. So Florida Atlantic is a program going forward that I think might start to resemble Gonzaga a little bit. Their coach was a former GA at Gonzaga, I think he was ops director, and then he's been at Baylor for a while. So they might end up resembling Baylor a little bit, but Baylor and Gonzaga not horribly different in how they run things right now. Roger Powell was a former Gonzaga assistant coach. He's the head coach at Valparaiso right now. He wasn't at Gonzaga for a super long time, and I haven't looked super deep into their system to see what they do. Last offseason, Gary Bell Jr., former Gonzaga guard, he was a guest on the podcast, and he acknowledged that he is the offensive coordinator, was the title he said at Northern Arizona, and that he is attempting to run a lot of Gonzaga's different sets at Northern Arizona. So that's another school that I would keep an eye on as well. And I think there's other programs that might fit. Samford runs a super unique offensive set, but they like to get up and down the floor a lot. Charleston under Pat Kelsey was like way up and down, super high tempo. Obviously, Pat Kelsey's now at Louisville, so not going to work there. And I think that's part of it too, is coaches are changing around so much that it's hard to find consistent systems that will kind of replicate Gonzaga, where Mark Few and the staff will go towards those programs to look for players. I don't really envision that being a future reality for Gonzaga, but I do think that certainly the staff, when they're evaluating players they want to bring in, they're looking at how similar the system that team runs is to the system that Gonzaga is running. We're going to talk about some former Zags who maybe didn't get a fair shake from the NBA. We're also going to talk about who we want to see Gonzaga face in their tournament this year, the battle for Atlantis. All that coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, LinkedIn Jobs. Folks, when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster, and they do it for free. And LinkedIn is not just another job board. They help you hire professionals that you cannot find anywhere else, even those who are not actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. And in a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users do not visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, folks, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses will get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is also constantly finding ways to make their process even easier. They just launched a feature that helps you write your own job descriptions, which is not only easier, it is quicker as well. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, still rolling along here on a full episode of Mailbag Monday. This next question here comes from Condor 2017 on Discord, who says, lots of discussion about Anton's potential outlook in the NBA this week. Who are some former Zags that you believe should have gotten more of a look in the NBA? This includes guys that didn't make it due to injury. Yeah, there's a lot of guys from Gonzaga who got really brief looks in the NBA. And look, it is hard to stick in the NBA. It is hard to stick in the NBA. The amount of guys from Gonzaga who played 2 games, 6 games, 12 games, 17 games in the NBA, or were part of training camp for 3-4 straight seasons and never actually really made it into the league. It's a ton, and it's a ton from every program. This is pretty common. I'll give a few guys, though. And there's 2 guys who I think would have been better if they had come along a little later, and 1 guy who would have been better if he had come along a little sooner. Casey Calvary and Elias Harris are 2 that come to mind. Elias Harris played 2 games in the NBA with the Los Angeles Lakers. Casey Calvary never played in the NBA. Both those guys in the modern game as 6'8", small ball 4s, they would be very good. They were power forwards in college who didn't make the NBA because their size wasn't perceived as big enough to be power forwards in the NBA, back when power forwards in the NBA played like Rasheed Wallace or played like Karl Malone and were like big, beefy, strong, low post scoring types. Now, with power forwards in the modern NBA being stretch forwards and guys who can play away from the rim, I think both those guys would have succeeded. Meanwhile, Drew Timme, who may still get more of an opportunity, he's only in his first professional season. He was hurt a lot of last year with that foot injury. Drew Timme would have probably only lasted 1 or 2 years in college 25 years ago, because his style, the low post, back to the basket, score around the rim, great footwork, that style was dominant in the NBA for decades, but it's not how the modern NBA is played. So I think there's a lot of guys who kind of, those are three that come to mind who really fit that. I thought Kevin Pango should have gotten a better look. It took 6 years of him playing in Europe before he got signed to an NBA team. He didn't last very long in Cleveland, and I thought he should have got a better shot. I think realistically, he should have gotten a shot 6-7 years ago, not after he was already in his 30s and had dealt with a handful of injuries. I think it's unfortunate that he didn't get that look coming out of college, because I think he deserved it. Killian Tilly dealing with injuries when he was playing in the NBA with the Memphis Grizzlies, he was very good. I think there's reasonable expectation that if he hadn't had the injury issues, he could have carved out a career. He probably wouldn't have been a starter or like a 20-plus minute per game guy, but he could have absolutely carved out a role as a stretch four coming off the bench. And it's sad to me that the combination of injuries and not getting a super strong look from teams kind of prevented that from being a reality for him. Next question here comes from Pete via Gmail. Pete says, when will the new Gonzaga team members be allowed to play or informally practice with returning team members in an unstructured and uncoached session? Do team members spend time in Spokane over the summer in order to play together? Seems like it would be a good thing for new players to experience on the court. When are Braeden Smith, Caliph Battle, Emmanuel Innocenti, and Michael Ajayi expected to be living on campus for the upcoming school year? Yeah, so these guys are going to take summer classes. The whole team's going to take summer classes. When you see basketball players graduate in 3 years or graduate early or start master's programs or whatever, it's mostly because they take summer classes. That's not a knock on them. It's not an insult. It's just a fact. And I'm using data mostly from some conversations I've had with Gonzaga folks, just tracking this team year round in the past, and also as somebody who worked at both Seattle University and the University of Portland, full-time in academic support, I know that every single one of their basketball players took summer classes. That is just how this works. I don't know exactly the dates that summer school starts for Gonzaga. I assume it is sometime this month, and the team will all be together. And I think it's important to remember when the team is and isn't together, because there was a lot of conversations when Michael Ajayi first committed to Gonzaga, when Gonzaga was still in the NCAA tournament, and then he declared for the draft, and people were like, why isn't he thanking Mark Few? Like, why isn't he talking about Gonzaga? Like, there's not pictures of him. It's like, he probably hadn't ever, he was still a student at Pepperdine. Like, they're still students. They're still in school. And I know it's hard, especially in the modern college basketball era where things look more and more like professional sports and free agency and all of that. I think it's hard to remember that, like, transferring isn't just them playing for a different school or a different program. It's them literally transferring to a new school, and credits have to transfer over, and they have to pick a major. And like, there's a lot of more that goes into this. And so, like, for Michael Ajayi, like, he was still a Pepperdine student when he committed to Gonzaga, and he remained a student at Pepperdine until he finished the year, and then he goes to Gonzaga. So these guys are all going to be around in the summer. They're all going to take summer classes. If you see posts of them, somewhere else on social media, doesn't mean anything, but they will be around in the summer. They will be playing together. They will get that experience before the season starts, before the school year starts in September. And then when practices start officially at Craziness in the Kennel is when things will get fully going, of course, in October. Next question here comes from GU Big Rig on Discord, who says, the bracket for the 2025 Battle for Atlantis has not been announced yet. Of the teams in the tourney, if you could pick the team Gonzaga plays first, which team would you pick? If you could pick the other two teams on Gonzaga's side of the bracket, which would you pick? And would you rather see Arizona on Gonzaga's side of the bracket or have Arizona on the other side and roll the dice hoping for a title game? Yeah, you got to give me the title game. Look, Gonzaga and Arizona are the two best teams in this tournament. There's some other great teams here. I think Indiana's loaded up in a really significant way. I like what that team has with former Gonzaga and Arizona player Umar Ballo on the roster for the Hoosiers. I think there's a real chance they could pull off an upset here and win this thing. Oklahoma is in this thing. Providence is in this thing. Davidson, West Virginia. Like, there's some good teams, but Gonzaga and Arizona are the two best teams. So whether you want them to be on the opposite side or not, they're going to be. I can almost guarantee you, unless something very shocking happens, Gonzaga and Arizona will be on opposite sides of this bracket. In terms of who I want to play first, give me Louisville. Give me the Cardinals. Give me Pat Kelsey's team. This team is completely loaded up. Totally different team, like literally top to bottom, different roster than what they had last year. Pat Kelsey comes in from Charleston, leads them to 2 straight 30-win seasons, NCAA tournament, and takes over for Kenny Payne, who was a nightmare for the Louisville squad. Rebuilds the entire roster from scratch. Tons of fantastic transfers. Chucky Hepburn from Wisconsin, Corin Johnson from Washington, Javon Hadley from Colorado. Terrence Edwards was fantastic at James Madison last year. They had Cason Pryor, who was kind of a pseudo Gonzaga target at one point this offseason in the portal as well. I think if you're talking about teams that's realistic that Gonzaga would get matched up with first, Davidson is the worst team here. Davidson will probably end up playing Gonzaga or Arizona. I think the other first team is either going to be Louisville or West Virginia. If I could pick, give me Louisville in that one. And then give me West Virginia and Indiana rounding it out. So you got Gonzaga versus Louisville. You got West Virginia versus Indiana. I love that being the side of the region that Gonzaga is on. That would put the other side would be Arizona, Oklahoma, Providence, and Davidson. I don't think this is that likely, but it could happen. It could happen. In that reality, Gonzaga plays Louisville. They play the winner of West Virginia and Indiana, which is probably Indiana. So they get Louisville, Indiana, and Arizona. That's the dream right there. And I love Providence. I love this program. I love Kim English. I think they're fantastic, but I'm not sold on them right now. I think they're a good team, but I'd rather play the other teams. I like West Virginia. I like Darian DeVries, who comes over from Drake. He brings his son, Tucker DeVries, who scored 21 points per game last year. West Virginia is going to be back. They're not going to be great, I don't think, but they're going to be back. But yeah, if I could pick the matchups for Gonzaga, give me Louisville, give me Indiana, give me Arizona in that championship, a matchup for that everybody's been wanting against Tommy Lloyd and the Wildcats. Well, folks, we're going to close out the show talking about a handful of things, including where Gonzaga slides in my way too early, although I've already done a few of these, top 10 list for the 24-25 season. More on that and other things in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, FanDuel. Folks, it is playoff time. In fact, it's NBA Finals time for the National Basketball Association. The Stanley Cup Finals rolling around too. Baseball is, of course, in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. So bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And if you got some money burning a hole in your pocket and you are ready to toss it down on the Zags, this fantastic roster that Mark Few has built for the 2025 National Championship, they are at plus 1,800 odds. And folks, they are dropping fast. They started the offseason at plus 3,000. They're up to plus 1,800. You want to capitalize on the amount of income that you can make watching the Zags tear down the Nets in 2025, then what are you waiting for? Go to FanDuel.com/lockedon right now and make your first bet an automatic W. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, closing out this mailbag edition of the show here. We got a question here from Jackie Daytona on Discord who says, what are your way too early top 10 teams in the country for this upcoming season? Yes, my co-host Isaac Shade and I have talked about this a few times on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. For those of you who have not checked it out, it is a national show about college hoops. Again, my co-host Isaac Shade is also the host of Locked On Tar Heels, so we got some East Coast, West Coast flavor on the show. Fantastic. Check it out if you haven't already. Yeah, we talked about this a few times on there. I've done some writing about my top 10, my top 25 lists for College Sports Wire at USA Today as well. But it updates daily. And it was a big update as necessary after the NBA draft withdrawal deadline. We saw, two key players come back for Alabama. We saw Arizona bring Caleb Love back. We saw UConn get Alex Caravan back. Like, all that makes a pretty big difference in how to evaluate the top 10. So this is the top 10 that I put together right now. I will tinker with it pretty consistently from now until the start of the season. But I got Kansas and Alabama at 1 and 2. I think there's an argument on which direction you want to go there, but Kansas brings back Hunter Dickinson, DeJuan Harris. They bring back KJ Adams. They add in AJ Storrs, one of the best transfers in the country, coming over from Wisconsin. That's a really good, deep, talented team. Alabama, same situation. They bring back a ton of talent with Mark Sears coming back, with Grant Nelson coming back. They add Cliff Omarui from Rutgers. They add Aiden Holloway from Auburn, some talented players coming in the portal. They got a nice freshman class coming in as well. Nate Oates' team, they're going to be good next year. And then I got Gonzaga at 3. Zags at 3 right now. This roster was so good last year in the second half of the season once they all kind of found their roles. Mike Ajayi is a great replacement for Anton Watson. Caleb Battle is exactly what this team needs. The depth is there. This team is going to be fantastic next year. I got him at 3. Then I got 3 straight Big 12 teams after that. Iowa State at 4, Houston at 5, Baylor at 6. You could argue that order a bunch of different ways. I like these teams. Iowa State retains a ton of talent, brings in Joshua Jefferson. Houston retains a ton of talent, brings in Milos Uzan from Oklahoma. They do lose starting point guard Jamal Shedd. Baylor, Jeremy Roach from Duke comes in. Norchad Omier from Miami comes in. VJ Edgecombe, one of the best freshmen in the country. Hard to knock the Bears of Baylor. And then I rounded out my 4 other schools. Duke, Cooper Flagg is the best freshman in the country next year. He's going to be one of the best players in college basketball. Hard to not have them on this list. Creighton, who I think is the best team in the Big East, and a lot of people will push back on that, but they get Pop Isaacs from Texas Tech to help replace the loss of Trey Alexander. Jemiah Neal comes over from Arizona State to help replace Baylor Shireman. They keep Ryan Kalkbrenner. They keep Stephen Ashworth. I think the Creighton team is in a good shape. I got Arizona at 9. Tommy Lloyd's team, ton of additions in the portal. They lost a ton of talent too, but they keep Caleb Love. They keep Jaden Bradley. I like the additions of Trey Townsend from Oakland. I like some of the other additions they got coming in, some quality freshmen joining that team as well. And then give me UConn at 10. I wasn't sure on UConn. North Carolina was in the mix. A couple other teams as well. I'm not nearly as sold on UConn as a lot of other people. They developed talent really well, and they had a lot of guys who were bench players last year who are going to step into bigger roles. That worked with Donovan Clingan. That worked with Alex Karaban, who took on a bigger role last year. That's worked for them in the past, and I think it'll work to an extent here. But I'm not as sold on Aiden Mahaney being a huge piece for them. I think he'll be good, but he's not going to be as good as Cam Spencer was. And I don't think Liam McNeely, the star freshman, is going to be quite as good as Stephon Castle. They're kind of impossible players to compare because they play very different styles. But I'm a little bit more cautious on UConn. Having said that, I still have them as a top 10 team in the country, so still some optimism for what Danny Hurley's team can do. Next question here comes from Heartland Zag on Discord, who says, with the Magic out of the NBA playoffs, how far do you think they could have made it if they picked Chet instead of Paolo? Do you think they advanced further or no? I think no. And that's not because I think Paolo Banchero is a better player than Chet Holmgren. The roster-wise, it doesn't work. The Orlando team is kind of built around Paolo. They have Franz Wagner, who's a great scorer on his own, but guys like Jalen Suggs and Cole Anthony and some of the other guys in this team are good players. Anthony Black, good players who I think need like a star player, a star scorer. Chet's not a star scorer. He wasn't that in high school. He wasn't that at Gonzaga. He wasn't that at Oklahoma City. He's a good scorer. He's a great scorer, frankly, but he's not a star go-to basket scorer. That's why he works great with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander at Oklahoma City. Paolo is the dude for Orlando. He is their leading scorer. He is the bucket getter. If you take him off that roster, yeah, they get better defensively with Chet. The floor spacing, I think, is really good with him, but you don't have that like ball dominant forward player on that roster. Wagner steps into that role. Maybe it works. Maybe it doesn't. I think Orlando is built around Paolo Banchero, and frankly, Oklahoma City is built around Shai, but Chet fits in Orlando. He fits in Oklahoma City perfectly, and I think Orlando is fit well around Paolo Banchero. So I don't think that it necessarily makes them better, even though I think Chet is a more impactful player than Banchero, and I think he will continue to be going forward. Final question of the show comes from Way of Life via Discord, who says, basketball players from France are increasing their footprint in college basketball and the NBA, as evidenced by 3 players in the top 11 of your projected draft and 5 overall. What can we learn about France's basketball development and fit for the U.S. game? Yeah, this is a good time to acknowledge another piece of Gonzaga news that happened over the weekend. Nolan Traore, who was a target for Gonzaga as a recruit who visited for the San Diego State game last year. He's staying in France. He's a projected top 5 pick in the 2025 NBA draft, and he probably will be a top 5 pick. He's extraordinarily good. I didn't think there was a super high chance he was going to come to college basketball at all. Gonzaga was in the mix. Alabama was in the mix, handful of places, but he's making the right decision, continuing to play professionally in France. In terms of answer the question, I think there's a lot of factors, and I think that there's so much variety in factors that I don't think that it's any one thing in particular. I think part of it is that the rules between the NBA and college are just different enough that players who dominate in college basketball don't necessarily dominate in the NBA. Drew Timme being an example of that, Oscar Tshiebwe, those types of back-to-the-basket, low-post scorers, Armando Bacot, Hunter Dickinson, etc. And then even like the smaller guards, the R.J. Davises, the Caleb Loves, the Mark Sears, like these really good college players are not going to be dominant NBA players because the NBA values length and size and floor spacing. And so I think France's professional leagues just play more similarly to the NBA than college does. I mean, I think it's again, there's a lot of factors, but fundamentally, I think it's mostly that. I think it's also just the French, the youth in France right now is really good. And it just kind of ebbs and flows. They have a handful of really good players right now. Wembanyama has kind of helped elevate the attention that they get. But guys like Reece Haché, who's a projected top five pick this year's draft, Ryan Rupert, who was drafted by the Blazers last year. Like, there's just a handful of good French basketball players. There always has been. Tony Parker was a French basketball superstar like 20 years ago when he came up with the San Antonio Spurs. Like, they have had great players in the past. Nick Batum was one of my favorite players growing up for the Portland Trail Blazers. Like, it's not uncommon for them to have this kind of success. I just think that less great college players are translating at the NBA level, so you're seeing them start to go internationally. And so I think that France just happens to be the country right now where you're seeing a lot of those guys come from. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. I appreciate all of you. We're in June. We're months removed from the last college basketball season. We're months away from the next college basketball season. The fact that you're all still out here listening to the show, learning about the Zags, hearing what I have to say, I really appreciate it sincerely. And I look forward to continuing to do shows for you 5 days a week for the next couple of months. Very excited about that. So thanks again for listening. Join the Discord channel. If you have not done so yet, we can chat in there 24/7. We'll be back later this week. More updates on Anton Watson as he goes through the draft process. More updates on Gonzaga's 13th and final scholarship spot as we wait to see if they're going to land an international prospect for that spot or not. All that coming up on the Locked On Zags podcast this week. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, as always, go Zags.